The steel door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed through his bones. Silas stood motionless in the center of the common area, his black hair catching the harsh fluorescent light that bathed Ironwood Maximum Security Penitentiary in its cold, clinical glow. 14 days. That's how long he'd been inside these concrete walls, and already the weight of institutional decay pressed against his chest, like a physical thing he'd seen worse. Done worse. The bar fight that landed him here played on an endless loop in his mind. Two drunk idiots arguing over a woman he'd stepped between them like he'd done 100 times before. Professional. Calm. But then the knife came out. Silver flash in the dim light instinct took over. The training from his old life, the life he'd buried 10 years ago, surged through him. One movement. Clean. Efficient. And the man was dead before he hit the floor. Self-defense, his lawyer said. Manslaughter at worst. But the prosecutor painted him as a reformed gang leader who couldn't escape his violent nature. The jury saw a man with a past, not a bar owner trying to keep the peace. Now he was here, surrounded by men who lived by the same code he'd once commanded. The common area buzzed with controlled chaos. Inmates clustered in tribal formations, invisible boundaries marking territories as clearly as painted lines. Silas had learned to read the landscape quickly. 3 major powers controlled Ironwood. The Aryan Brotherhood held the north side, their pale skin and hate-filled tattoos marking them like uniforms. The Black Guerrilla family commanded the east, organized and militant. And then there were the Disciples, a multi-ethnic coalition that operated like a corporate enterprise, dealing in contraband, protection, and influence. It was the Disciples who had noticed him first. Silas walked to an empty table near the far wall, carrying his lunch tray with measured steps. Every movement deliberate, every gesture calculated. In here, body language was currency. Show weakness, and you'd be devoured. Show too much strength, and you'd be tested. He'd found the narrow path between the two, the same balance that had kept him alive during his years running the streets. New fish looking comfortable. The voice came from behind him. Silas didn't turn. He set his tray down, pulled out the metal chair, and sat. Only then did he glance up. 2 men approached. The first was built like a freight train, muscles straining against his orange jumpsuit, a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck. The second was lean and wiry, with quick eyes that never stopped moving. Both wore the subtle markings of the Disciples, a certain way of rolling their sleeves, the specific fold of their collars. "You hear me talking to you?" The big one moved closer, his shadow falling across Silas's tray. Silas picked up his fork, speared a piece of mystery meat, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes never leaving the men's faces. The silence stretched. Other inmates began to notice. Conversations died down. This was entertainment in a place where boredom was its own form of torture. "My name's Silas," he said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "And I'm eating my lunch." The lean one laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Got a mouth on him, Marcus. I like that." Marcus, the big one, didn't smile. "You know how things work in here, new fish? You know there's a tax for peaceful living?" "A tax?" Silas set down his fork. "That's an interesting word for extortion." "Call it what you want." Marcus leaned down, his meaty hands pressing against the table. "Every man in here pays for protection, $20 a week, commissary credits, small price for staying healthy." Silas studied him, measured the distance between them, calculated angles and vulnerabilities, the way he used to calculate street corners and escape routes. Marcus was big, but big men moved slow. The lean one was the real threat. Quick hands, Probably carried a shank in his waistband. "I don't need protection," Silas said. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down on concrete. Around them, the common area had gone completely silent. Every inmate watching now, every eye locked on this small drama unfolding. In prison, these moments defined hierarchies. They established order. Or they shattered it. Marcus straightened up, his face darkening. "You refusing?" "I'm stating a fact." Silas picked up his fork again. "I don't need protection. I don't want trouble. I just want to do my time and go home." "See? That's where you're wrong, new fish." The lean one stepped forward. "You're already in trouble. You just don't know it yet." What happened next surprised everyone, including Silas himself. He'd spent 10 years being calm, being measured, being the reformed man who poured drinks and broke up fights with words instead of fists. But something in the lean one's tone, something in the casual cruelty of the threat, flipped a switch inside him. The old Silas stirred. The man who'd run a crew of 30, the man who'd held territory through reputation and ruthless efficiency. "Let me tell you something," Silas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been in here 2 weeks. In that time, I've watched you boys operate. I've seen your little protection racket. I've counted 17 men paying your tax. That's $340 a week flowing up to whoever runs your crew. Not bad for prison work." Marcus and the lean one exchanged glances. This wasn't the response they expected. "I've also noticed," Silas continued, "that you two are collectors, not decision-makers. You're soldiers low-level, which means you're here to test me, to see if I'll fold. If I do, you bring the money up the chain and get a pat on the head. If I don't, you're supposed to make an example." The lean one's hand drifted toward his waistband. Silas tracked the movement without looking directly at it. "But here's what you haven't figured out," Silas said, standing slowly. He was shorter than Marcus by 4 inches, but something in his posture made the big man take a half-step back. "I'm not some civilian who got caught with drugs in his car. I'm not a white-collar criminal who embezzled from his company. I'm someone who used to do exactly what you're doing now, except I did it better. I did it smarter. And I did it for 10 years without getting caught." The truth of it rang in his words. The lean one's hand stopped moving toward his waistband. "So here's my answer to your tax," Silas said. "No. I won't be paying. I won't be joining. And I won't be bothered again. Because if you come back, if you push this, I'll have to remind both of you what real violence looks like. And trust me, that's not a reminder anyone enjoys." For a long moment, nobody moved. The common area held its collective breath. Guards watched from their stations but didn't intervene. This was prison law playing out. As long as no weapons appeared and no blood was spilled, they let the inmates sort their own hierarchies. Marcus cracked his knuckles. Big words from a man eating alone. "Walk away," Silas said, "while you still can." The lean one laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, Marcus. We'll be back for this one." They turned to leave, and that's when it happened. Marcus, perhaps feeling his authority slipping in front of the watching crowd, perhaps genuinely offended, perhaps just stupid, swung back around and threw a punch. It was telegraphed. Clumsy. Exactly the kind of move Silas had been expecting. He slipped the punch by inches, felt the air displacement as Marcus's fist sailed past his ear. In the same motion, Silas drove his elbow up into Marcus's solar plexus. The big man folded like a cheap tent, all his air exploding out in a whoosh. Before he could recover, Silas grabbed the back of his head and drove his knee up into Marcus's face. Once, twice, 3 times. Blood sprayed across the floor. The lean one finally got his shank out, a crude piece of sharpened metal wrapped in tape. He lunged forward, aiming for Silas's ribs, but Silas had been in 100 knife fights. He'd been cut, stabbed, slashed. He knew the rhythm of blade work. He caught the lean one's wrist, twisted hard until bones ground together. The shank clattered to the floor. Silas swept the man's legs out from under him and followed him down, his knee driving into the lean one's chest. Then he started hitting him. Methodical, calculated. Not wild swings, but precise strikes to the face, the throat, the soft, vulnerable places that turned bravado into fear. "Break it up! Break it up!" The guards finally moved, batons out, voices barking orders. Silas stepped back immediately, hands raised, blood on his knuckles, but not his own. Marcus lay on the floor groaning, his face a mask of red. The lean one coughed and gasped, trying to breathe through a crushed windpipe. They dragged Silas away. He didn't resist, didn't speak. His face remained calm, composed, as if he'd just finished a conversation rather than dismantled two men in front of 300 witnesses. In the isolation cell, waiting for his disciplinary hearing, Silas sat in the darkness and thought about what he'd just done. He'd broken his own rule: stay quiet, stay calm, do the time. But something about this place, about being caged again, had awakened the old hunger. The need to establish dominance, to remind the predators that he was apex. The cell door opened. A guard stood silhouetted in the fluorescent light. "Warden wants to see you." Silas stood and walked out, his wrists now cuffed in front of him. They led him through the labyrinth of corridors, past cells where men watched him with new interest. Word had already spread. The new fish had teeth. The new fish had put 2 disciples in the infirmary. The warden's office was surprisingly pleasant wood furniture, actual paintings on the walls, a window that looked out over the prison yard. Warden Hayes sat behind his desk, a thick file open in front of him. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and the weary eyes of a man who'd seen too much human misery. "Silas Cormac," Hayes said, reading from the file. 47 years old, former owner of the Anchor Bar in South Boston, convicted of voluntary manslaughter, 18 months to 5 years. He looked up. "Your lawyer's filing appeals." "Yes, sir." "Says you acted in self-defense." "Yes, sir." Hayes closed the file. "But that's not the interesting part of your record, is it? The interesting part is what happened before you owned that bar. The 10 years you spent running the South Side crew. The 10 years you somehow avoided prison while everyone around you got locked up." Silas said nothing. His face remained neutral. "You know what I think?" Hayes leaned back in his chair. "I think you got smart. I think you saw where that life was heading, and you got out, opened a legitimate business. Stayed clean. And then one stupid moment of bad luck put you right back in the world you'd escaped." "It was self-defense," Silas said quietly. "I believe you." Hayes surprised him with that. "I've read the police reports, watched the security footage. That man came at you with a knife. You reacted. Any reasonable person would have done the same." He paused. "But now you're here. And what you did in the common area today, that's going to have consequences. They came at me. I know I've got 36 witnesses who'll confirm that. But here's the problem, Mr. Cormac. The disciples run a significant portion of this facility. They control the drug trade, the protection rackets, and half the guards on my payroll. When you put 2 of their soldiers in the infirmary, you declared war, whether you meant to or not." Silas felt ice forming in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. He knew what came next, because he'd ordered it himself, back in his old life. When someone challenged your authority, you responded with overwhelming force. You made an example. You reminded everyone why they paid the tax. "How long do I have?" he asked. Hayes appreciated the directness. "They'll move fast tomorrow, maybe the day after. They'll catch you somewhere isolated. The showers, the library, maybe even your cell if they can get to your cellmate first." He stood up, walked to the window. "I can't protect you, Mr. Cormack. I don't have the resources or the political capital. The best I can do is keep you in isolation for a few days. After that, you're back in general population." "That just delays it." "Yes." They stood in silence for a moment, two men who understood the brutal mathematics of survival. "Can I ask you something?" Hayes turned from the window. "Why didn't you just pay the tax? $20 a week. Small price for peace." Silas thought about his answer carefully. "Because once you pay, you never stop paying. They own you. And I've spent 10 years being my own man. I'm not going back to being owned. Not by them, not by anyone." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then I hope you're as good as your reputation suggests, Mr. Cormack, because you're going to need every bit of that old skill to survive what's coming." They sent him back to his cell. His cellmate, a skinny kid named Tommy doing time for drug possession, took one look at Silas's face and climbed onto his top bunk without a word. Smart kid. Silas lay on his thin mattress and stared at the concrete ceiling. He'd made his move, thrown down the gauntlet. Now the disciples would respond, and when they did, he'd need to be ready. Not just physically. That was the easy part. He'd need to be strategic, tactical. He'd need to think 3 moves ahead, like he used to do when he ran the streets. The old skills were coming back. Muscle memory of a life he'd tried to leave behind. But maybe, he thought, maybe that was what he needed. Maybe the only way to survive this place was to become what he used to be. The predator, the strategist, the man who could turn chaos into order through pure, calculated violence. Outside his cell, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Voices murmured, the prison settling into its nighttime rhythm. But Silas didn't sleep. He couldn't afford to. Because somewhere in this facility, men were planning his death. And he needed to be ready to plan theirs first. The game had begun. And Silas Cormack had never lost a game he truly played. 3 days in isolation gave Silas time to think, time to plan, time to remember strategies he'd buried alongside his old life. When they finally released him back into general population, the prison had changed, or rather, his perception of it had. Where he once saw chaos, he now saw patterns. Where he once saw random violence, he now saw calculated power plays. The 3 gangs weren't just criminal organizations, they were businesses. And like any business, they had strengths, weaknesses, and pressure points. The disciples moved first, exactly as predicted. It happened in the shower room on his second day back. 4 men, not 2. They'd learned from Marcus and the lean one's mistake. Don't send soldiers. Send an execution squad. Silas stood under the spray of lukewarm water when they entered, their footsteps echoing off tile walls. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge them, just kept washing, his movements calm, his breathing steady. "You made a mistake, old man," the leader said. His name was Crosby, a lifer with dead eyes and scars that told stories of decades behind bars. "You embarrassed us. Now we embarrass you." Silas finally turned, water streaming down his face. 4 against 1. That's not embarrassment. That's fear. Crosby's face twisted. He moved forward, shank in hand. The others spread out, boxing Silas against the wall. This was it, the moment that would define everything. Fight and probably die, or find another way. Wait, Silas said, his voice cutting through the tension. Before you do this, answer me one question. Who benefits? Crosby stopped, confused by the question. What? Who benefits from my death? Silas kept his hands visible, non-threatening. You four get nothing. Maybe some respect from your crew. But the Aryan Brotherhood and the Black Gorilla family? They're watching this, watching you waste resources on one man while they expand their operations. They're laughing at you. Shut up, one of the others said. But uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The shot caller sent you here to make a point, Silas continued, his tone conversational despite the shanks pointed at his chest. But what point? That the disciples are so weak, so threatened by one man, that they need 4 soldiers to handle him? That's not strength. That's desperation. Crosby's jaw clenched. You think you're smart? You think talking saves you? No, I think information saves me. Silas took a calculated risk. I know the disciples are losing ground. The AB just took over the West Block commissary. The BGF is cutting into your drug routes, your bleeding territory, and your leadership is panicking. Killing me doesn't fix any of that. It just wastes 4 good soldiers on personal revenge, while your real enemies circle. The words landed. Silas could see it in their faces. These men weren't stupid. They were career criminals who'd survived decades in maximum security. They understood strategy. They understood when they were being used. So, what's your angle? Crosby asked, not lowering his weapon, but not advancing either. My angle is survival, Silas said. Same as yours, same as everyone's in here. But I'm not interested in joining your crew. I'm not interested in paying your tax. I'm interested in being left alone. And maybe, if your leadership was smart, they'd realize I could be more useful as neutral territory than as a corpse. It was a gamble, a long shot, but sometimes the only way to win was to change the game entirely. Crosby studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. Neutral territory. I'll tell them. But don't hold your breath, old man. They don't like being told no. They left. All 4 of them. Silas stood under the water for another 5 minutes, letting his heart rate slow, letting the adrenaline drain from his system. He'd bought time. Maybe a day. Maybe a week. But time was all he needed. Because, while they were talking, he'd been observing cataloging, planning. The chessboard was laid out. Now he just needed to place his pieces. That evening in the yard, Silas found his first piece. Ramon Garcia sat alone near the far fence, reading a battered paperback. He was small, wiry, with intelligent eyes, and the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to survive through brains rather than muscle. Silas had noticed him during his first week, noticed how the disciples extorted him weekly, noticed how he paid without complaint, but with barely concealed hatred in his eyes. Silas sat down next to him, uninvited. Ramon looked up, startled. I don't have any cigarettes, Ramon said quickly, the automatic response of a man used to being shaken down. Don't want any, Silas said. Want to ask you a question. How long you been paying the tax? Ramon's eyes narrowed. Why? Because I'm not paying it. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one who's tired of it. You're the guy who put Marcus in the infirmary. It wasn't a question. Everyone knew. I am. Then you're a dead man. They don't forgive. They don't forget. Probably, Silas agreed. Unless I change the game. Unless I build something strong enough to push back, you interested in that? Ramon closed his book carefully. You're talking about starting a war. I'm talking about ending an extortion racket. There's a difference. For a long moment, Ramon said nothing. Then, there are others. Guys who pay because they have no choice. Guys who would fight if they thought they had a chance. How many? Maybe 15, 20. Not fighters, not gangsters, just regular people trying to survive. That's enough, Silas said. If they're organized, if they're smart. And you're going to organize them? Some bar owner doing 18 months for manslaughter? Silas met his eyes. I used to run a crew, long time ago. Different life. But I remember how it worked. I remember how to build power from nothing. Ramon studied him, weighing the risk against the potential reward. Finally, he nodded. I'll talk to them. But if you're playing us, if this is some setup, we'll know. Fair enough. Over the next week, Silas met with Ramon's contacts one by one. Quiet conversations in the library, the chapel, the corners of the yard where guards didn't patrol as carefully. Each man had the same story. Fear. Extortion. The crushing weight of paying tribute while trying to survive their sentences. Silas listened more than he talked. He learned their skills, their strengths, their connections. A former accountant who could track money flows. A mechanic who understood the prison's infrastructure. A lawyer who knew how to file complaints that would actually be investigated. These weren't soldiers. They were resources. And resources, properly deployed, were more valuable than muscle. But he needed muscle, too. He found it in the most unexpected place. The weight room. Silas was doing pull-ups when he heard the familiar cadence of Spanish being spoken nearby. Not the modern slang of current gang members, but the older dialect of street veterans from a different era. He turned and saw two men spotting each other on the bench press. One was massive, with gray in his beard and tattoos that marked him as old school. The other was lean and scarred, with the careful movements of someone who'd taken too many beatings to be careless. Silas recognized them instantly. Diego Hammer Martinez and Paulo Reyes. Soldiers from his old crew. Men he'd run with 15 years ago before he'd gotten out of the life. They'd been caught in a federal sweep 3 years back, sentenced to 10 years for racketeering. He approached carefully. Old alliances didn't always survive prison walls. Hammer, he said quietly. Diego looked up from the bench press, mid-rep. His eyes widened in recognition. No fucking way. Silas? Been a while. Diego let the bar slam back onto the rack. He sat up, staring. Paulo turned, his scarred face breaking into a rare smile. They said you got out clean, Paulo said. Said you went straight open some bar. I did. Then a bar fight went wrong, and here I am. Diego stood, moved closer. They were being watched. Everyone watched everything in here. But this reunion was too significant to hide. Heard about what you did to those disciple boys. Figured it might be you when I heard the description. Still got that cold approach. Didn't have a choice. You never do, hermano. Not in here. Diego glanced around the weight room. You need to be careful. They've been talking, planning. You know how it goes. I know. That's why I'm here. Need to ask you something. You and Paulo still remember how to run operations? Paulo's smile faded. You starting something? Finishing something. The disciples run protection rackets on half the population. I'm building a crew to push back interested? Diego and Paulo exchanged glances. Years of working together meant they could communicate without words. Finally, Diego nodded. Always figured if anyone could survive this place and come out on top, it'd be you. We're in, but you need more than 3 men and some bookkeepers. You need real allies. Already working on that. The next piece of the puzzle came together through careful observation and calculated risk. The Black Gorilla family and the Aryan Brotherhood hated each other with the passion of ideological enemies, but they hated the disciples more. The disciples were pragmatic, multi-ethnic, focused purely on profit. That flexibility made them powerful. It also made them threatening to organizations built on racial identity. Silas arranged 2 separate meetings. One with Marcus "Ice" Thompson, a BGF shot caller who controlled the East Wing. One with Jacob Keller, an AB lieutenant who ran operations in the West Block. He pitched the same proposal to both: temporary alliance against a common enemy. "You want us to work with you against the disciples?" Ice said, his voice skeptical. They sat across from each other in the library, pretending to study legal texts. "What's your play here, barman?" "My play is survival. But your play should be opportunity. The disciples control 30% of this facility's drug trade, 40% of the protection rackets, and they've got half the guards on their payroll. That's too much power in one crew's hands. Take them down, split their territory. Everyone wins." "Except you're not asking us to take them down," Ice said. "You're asking us to help you take them down. Then what? You become the new power?" "No, I become nobody. I finish my sentence and leave. But while I'm here, I'm a useful tool. I've got men willing to fight. I've got intelligence on their operations. And I've got motivation that doesn't threaten your territories." Ice considered this. "And what do you want in return?" "Protection for my crew. Safe passage. And when it's over, we all go back to our corners and forget this ever happened." It took 3 more conversations to convince him, but eventually Ice agreed. The AB was harder. Jacob Keller didn't trust easily, and trusted ex-gang leaders even less. "Why should I believe you're not playing both sides?" Keller demanded. They met in the prison chapel, a neutral zone where even gang violence was rare. "Because I'm not playing any sides," Silas said. "I'm playing survival. The disciples made me their enemy. I'm just using the resources available to fight back. When it's done, I disappear. You'll never hear from me again." "And if you're lying? If this is some elaborate setup?" Silas leaned forward. "Then kill me. Simple as that. But think about what you lose if you don't act. The disciples are expanding. Every day they get stronger. Every day they take more territory. You can sit back and watch them grow, or you can use me as the wedge that cracks them open. Your choice." Keller's blue eyes were cold as Arctic ice, but eventually he nodded. "One operation. We hit them once. If it works, we talk about more. If it fails, you're on your own." Fair enough. The first strike came 2 weeks later, carefully planned, meticulously executed. The disciples ran their drug operation through a complex network of dead drops and handoffs. Silas's accountant had tracked the money flows. His mechanic had identified the weak points in their distribution system. And through Ice and Keller, Silas learned where the disciples kept their main supply stash, the laundry room, behind a false panel in the dryer vent system. They didn't steal the drugs. That would have started an open war. Instead, they contaminated them, Silas's crew, working in shifts, carefully mixed in common cleaning chemicals that would make anyone who used the product violently ill, but not fatally, so enough to destroy the disciples' reputation without triggering a full investigation. Within 3 days, the prison infirmary was flooded with sick inmates, all of them disciples' customers. All of them furious at the crew that had sold them tainted product. The disciples scrambled to contain the damage, but trust was hard to rebuild. Customers defected. Territory was lost. And the other gangs moved in to fill the vacuum. The second strike was psychological. Silas had his lawyer, the former attorney in his crew, File formal complaints against 3 guards who were on the disciples' payroll. The complaints were detailed, specific, backed by evidence that had been carefully gathered over weeks. Nothing criminal enough to trigger arrests, but enough to start internal investigations that would sideline the guards and cut off the disciples' access to outside contraband. The third strike was social. Diego and Paulo, leveraging their old reputations, spread rumors through the prison grapevine. Stories about the disciples' leadership being soft about them losing control. About how they'd been outmaneuvered by one man and a crew of civilians. In prison, reputation was everything. Perception was reality. And the perception of the disciples was crumbling. The shot caller for the disciples, a man named Vincent Cross, finally requested a meeting. They met in the yard during free time, surrounded by their respective crews. Silas brought Diego, Paulo, and Ramon. Vincent brought 4 heavily armed enforcers. The tension was thick enough to cut. Vincent was in his early 40s, with a shaved head and the kind of presence that commanded attention without requiring volume. He'd run the disciples for 8 years, building them from a minor crew into the dominant force in Ironwood. "You've been busy," Vincent said without preamble. "Just protecting my interests," Silas replied. "Your interests? You mean disrupting our entire operation, costing us money, costing us respect." Vincent's voice remained calm, but fury burned in his eyes. "You could have paid $20 a week. Instead, you've cost us thousands. You could have left me alone. Instead, you tried to make an example. Choices have consequences." "They do." Vincent stepped closer. Around them, guards watched, but didn't intervene. This was a negotiation, not a fight. Yet. "So here's my choice. I can order your death. Tonight, tomorrow, next week. Doesn't matter. You'll die. Your crew will die. Everyone associated with you will die, or we can find another solution. I'm listening. You leave my organization alone. I leave yours alone. Neutral territory, like you suggested to Crosby. We don't interact. We don't interfere. When your sentence is up, you walk away and never look back." It was tempting. An easy out. But Silas had learned long ago that easy outs were traps. "And what guarantee do I have that you'll honor that agreement? What stops you from waiting until I let my guard down and then striking?" Vincent smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "The same guarantee I have that you won't keep sabotaging my operations. Mutual destruction. You touch my crew, I touch yours. I touch your crew. You have alliances with the BGF and AB that would start a war nobody wants. We're locked in a stalemate. Might as well make it official." Silas considered this, weighed the angles, looked for the trap. But Vincent was right. They'd reached equilibrium. Each side capable of destroying the other, neither willing to pay the cost. "One condition," Silas said. "The men in my crew, the ones who were paying your tax before I got here, they're exempt. Forever. You never touch them again." Vincent's jaw tightened. That was a significant concession. It meant losing revenue and admitting weakness. But after a long moment, he nodded. "Agreed. But this only works if you keep your word. No more sabotage, no more attacks. You fade into the background." That's all I ever wanted. They didn't shake hands, didn't formalize it with any gesture. In prison, your word was your bond, because breaking it meant death. They both understood that. The crews dispersed. The tension evaporated. And just like that, the war was over. Over the next 6 months, Silas kept his promise. He did his time quietly. Worked in the prison library, stayed out of politics. His crew gradually dissolved as members were released or transferred. Diego and Paulo were moved to a different facility 3 months later, their federal sentences requiring specialized housing. But the impact of what Silas had done rippled through Ironwood long after he left. The disciples never recovered their full power. The balance between the three major gangs shifted permanently, and the men who'd been under the thumb of extortion rackets found that they could organize, could resist, could create space for themselves, even in the most oppressive environment. Silas's appeal finally succeeded 14 months into his sentence. New evidence, a recantation from a witness, and a sympathetic judge combined to overturn his conviction. The day they released him, he walked out of Ironwood Maximum Security without looking back. But he carried the lessons with him. He reopened his bar 3 months later. The Anchor, same name, same location. And on slow nights, when the crowd thinned and he found himself wiping down the bar in solitude, he'd think about those days inside, about the careful strategy, about the alliances built from necessity, about how he'd taken everything he'd learned in his old life and used it to survive in the most dangerous place on earth. He'd gone into prison believing he'd left that part of himself behind. The gang leader, the strategist, the cold calculator who could turn chaos into order through pure force of will. He came out understanding that you never really leave it behind. You just learn when to use it, when the situation demands it, when survival requires you to become the predator instead of the prey. And most importantly, he'd learned that justice wasn't always about following the rules. Sometimes, true justice required understanding the system, identifying its weaknesses, and dismantling it from within, not with violence, not with brute force, but with intelligence, with strategy, with the cold, calculated patience of a man who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't hot and immediate. It was strategic, psychological, and absolutely devastating. The kind of revenge that left your enemies broken without them even realizing you'd destroyed them until it was far too late. Silas poured himself a whiskey and raised the glass to the empty bar. To survival, he thought, to strategy, to knowing when to fight and when to outthink, and to never, ever letting anyone make him feel powerless again.